Cole stood on his porch as dusk bled across the snow-covered plains of the Montana Territory. Christmas Eve. A bitter wind howled a lonely hymn, whipping flakes against the weathered wood of his cabin. It was a solid place. Good bones, but filled with ghosts. 3 years since Anna died, caught in the crossfire of a life he'd tried to bury out here. 3 years of silence, the only sounds the crackle of the hearth and the restless shifting of his horse in the barn. He was a gunslinger trying to forget the feel of a pistol in his hand, a man whose name was once whispered in fear from dusty saloons to high country passes. Now, he was just a man haunted by empty rooms. The notice nailed to the general store post had been a desperate, practical impulse. A shipment of labours from the east, auctioned to the highest bidder. It was a cruel transaction, but the loneliness was a cruelty of its own, a slow poison. He needed another heartbeat in the house, a presence to fight back the silence. He hadn't thought beyond that. He rode into the small, huddled town of Bitterroot as the church bells rang. Torches cast a flickering, hellish light on the makeshift platform erected in the center of town. A small crowd had gathered, stamping their feet against the cold, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The auctioneer, a man with a greasy smile, was shouting over the wind, his voice raw. At the center of the platform stood a line of people, shivering and gaunt. And at the end of the line, a young Chinese woman. She was bound in chains at the wrist and ankle, the iron stark against her thin cotton clothes. The crowd jeered, tossing insults like stones. Cole felt a familiar, cold anger tighten in his gut. The bidding was low, laced with contempt. "What's anyone supposed to do with that?" a man scoffed. "She ain't even big enough for farm work," the auctioneer struggled, his frustration growing. Cole watched the woman. She stood impossibly still, her head held high, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the jeering faces. She wasn't begging or crying. She was enduring. $20. Cole's voice cut through the murmurs, rough from disuse. The crowd turned, surprise on their faces. Flint, a brutish rancher who ran his land with an iron fist, smirked from the front row. "Look what we have here." The ghost of Bitterroot, come to buy himself a Christmas present, he spat. 25. Cole didn't look at him. 50. A gasp went through the crowd. Flint's eyes narrowed. This was no longer about the woman, it was a challenge. 55. 100, Cole said, his voice flat and final. The number hung in the frozen air. Flint stared, his pride warring with his wallet, and finally shook his head with a disgusted laugh. "He's all yours, Gunslinger. Enjoy your broken toy." The auctioneer slammed his gavel. "Sold." Cole walked up to the platform, handing the money over. He ignored the whispers and the stares. He stood before the woman, whose name he didn't even know. A guard unlocked her chains, which fell into the snow with a dull clank. For the first time, she looked at him. As she lifted her head, the torchlight caught her face. The left side was flawless, smooth as porcelain despite the grime and cold. But the right side, on her cheek just below the eye, was a brand. A cruel, intricate symbol seared into her skin, a mark of ownership. Cole's breath caught. He froze. Every calculated, practical thought he'd had vanished. He wasn't looking at cargo. He was looking at a survivor, a woman who had been through the fire and was still standing. Her eyes, dark and deep, held no plea for pity, only a defiant, exhausted dignity. He saw in them the reflection of a man he no longer wanted to be. He simply nodded toward his horse and wagon. "Come on," she followed him without a word, her steps careful in the deep snow. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch brief and impersonal. She flinched but didn't pull away. As they rode out of town, the sounds of mocking laughter followed them into the growing storm, a cruel Christmas carol on the biting wind. He had just made a choice he didn't fully understand, and as the lights of Bitterroot disappeared behind them, he wondered what kind of damn fool he had just become. The cabin was warm, a stark contrast to the blizzard raging outside. She stood in the center of the main room, a small, still figure dwarfed by the heavy timber beams. She looked around, her eyes cataloguing the sparse bachelor provisions, the dust on the mantel, the unswept floor. Cole watched from the doorway, uncertain. He had bought a person, and now he had no idea what to do with her. "You can get warm by the fire," he offered, his voice awkward. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and moved toward the hearth, shedding the thin blanket he'd given her. Her dress was worn, mended in a dozen places. She held her hands out to the flames, her back ramrod straight. "There's a room," he began, clearing his throat. "Upstairs. The main bedroom." "I will take the smallest room," she interrupted. Her voice was quiet, with a lilting accent, but the words were clear and precise. She nodded toward a small storage room off the kitchen. "That one is fine. That's not a proper room. You should have the bed." She finally turned to look at him, the brand on her cheek stark in the firelight. "Let us be clear, sir. You have bought my labor. I will cook, clean, and mend. Nothing more is expected or offered. A small room is sufficient for a servant." Her words were a wall, built of hard experience. Cole felt a pang of something that felt like shame. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't like that, but what was it like? He had bought her. The ugly truth of it stood between them. He retreated to the barn, the silence of the cabin suddenly more profound than when he was alone. Dinner was jerky and hardtack, softened in a stew. She cooked with a quiet competence that spoke of making much from very little. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the howling of the wind. "What is your name?" he finally asked. She said, not looking up from her plate. "Cole." The silence returned, heavier than before. He knew nothing about her beyond a name and a scar. Nothing of the life she'd led before being put on a platform in chains. Later, he returned from checking on the horses to find her small door closed. A thin line of lamplight glowed from underneath it. He lay in his own bed, Anna's bed, listening to the small sounds of a stranger's presence in his home. "What have I done?" he whispered into the darkness. In her small room, Mai touched the brand on her cheek. It was an old habit, a reminder of what she was, of what men saw when they looked at her. Another master, another cage. But this one was different. He hadn't been cruel. He hadn't touched her. He looked at her with something she couldn't name. Confusion? Pity? It didn't matter. She had survived worse. She would survive this. Days bled into a week. The blizzard passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine, silent blanket of white. Mai transformed the cabin. She found old fabrics in a trunk and mended the torn curtains. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. The scent of dust and neglect was replaced by the aroma of fresh bread and coffee. Cole found himself listening for the soft swish of her movements, small sounds that chipped away at the suffocating quiet. One morning, he came in from the cold to find the winter coat he'd torn on a fence post laid across the table. The seam was repaired with tiny, perfect stitches, stronger than the original. He ran his thumb over her work. "My mother taught me to sew," she said quietly from the stove, the first word she'd offered without being asked. "Mine, too," he replied. A small, fragile bridge built between them. A week after Christmas, they had to ride to town for supplies. As they hitched the wagon outside the general store, the town went quiet. Heads turned. Whispers followed them like shadows. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stopped them, her face a mask of pious concern. "Mr. Cole, we have been praying for you. And for this. Poor unfortunate soul." Her eyes dripped pity as she looked at Mai. "It is a great act of Christian charity you have performed." Mai's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "We need supplies, Mrs. Gable," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. Inside, the storekeeper's wife stared openly. Two young men snickered behind a stack of barrels. Cole felt a slow burn of anger, not at Mai, but at his neighbors, at himself for bringing her into this crucible of judgment. As they loaded the wagon, Flint blocked their path, his shadow falling over them. "Enjoying your purchase, Gunslinger?" His grin was a razor slash. He tipped his hat to me with mocking courtesy. Surprised he lets you out in the daylight. Bad for business. A face like that my didn't react, her expression a blank mask as she hoisted a sack of flour into the wagon herself. Tell me, Cole, Flint continued, stepping closer. Does she scream in a language you can understand? Or is that brand on her face to keep her quiet? Cole's hand instinctively drifted toward his hip, where his Colt used to hang. The motion was old, familiar, and terrifying. He stopped himself, his fists clenching at his sides. He was trying to be a different man. A quiet man. He said nothing. He just loaded the last of the supplies and climbed into the wagon beside me. Flint's laughter echoed down the street as they pulled away. The ride home was a long, cold mile of silence. Cole's knuckles were white on the reins. He had stood there and let that man insult her, humiliate her. He had chosen peace over her honor. Finally, her quiet voice broke the tension. You do not have to defend me. Maybe I have to defend myself, he said, the words torn from him. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not trust, but a crack in the wall of her certainty about him. That night, the distance between them felt different. It wasn't just the space between an owner and his property, but the chasm between two people wounded by the same world. The next morning, Cole was mending a harness in the barn when Flint and two of his men rode into the yard. Mai was hanging laundry, the bright colors stark against the snow. Cole! Flint called out, dismounting. I've come on business. I'll give you 200 for her. Double what you paid. A tidy profit for a week's work. Mai froze, her hand still on the clothesline. Cole walked out of the barn, his face grim. She's not for sale. Flint laughed. Everything's for sale. You're a gunslinger, not a rancher. What use do you have for her? You were too much of a coward to defend her in town. You're ashamed of her. I'm doing you a favor. He took a step toward Mai. I'll even let you keep the 100 you spent. Get off my land, Flint. Or what? You gonna talk me to death? Flint sneered. You're not the man you used to be. His men fanned out, their hands resting on their guns. Mai looked at Cole, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear she hadn't shown at the auction. She was expecting him to fail again. To trade her away. Something inside Cole snapped. The quiet man he had been trying to be was a lie, a costume that no longer fit. He wasn't protecting himself from his past, he was just letting it win. He took a slow step forward, away from the barn and into the open. The last man who called me a coward, Cole said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch that silenced the wind, is buried on a hill outside of Wichita. Flint's smile faltered. For the first time, he saw not the quiet homesteader, but the ghost he'd mocked. You have 3 seconds to ride out of here, Cole continued, before I remind you why people used to lock their doors when they heard my name. Flint hesitated, looking at his men, then back at the cold certainty in Cole's eyes. He saw no bluff. Cursing, he swung himself back onto his horse. This ain't over, Gunslinger. He spurred his horse and rode away, his men scrambling after him. The yard was silent again. Mai stood by the clothesline, staring at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. He had defended her. He had chosen her. He walked over to her, his heart pounding. He won't be back, he said. You're safe here. She searched his face, her eyes filled with a confusion that mirrored his own. Why? She whispered. Because this is your home, he said, the words feeling truer than anything he'd said in 3 years. That night, for the first time, she left her door ajar. The spring thaw came late, but when it did, it transformed the land. Green shoots pushed through the mud, and the creek swelled with melted snow. They planted a garden together, working side by side in the warm earth. He showed her how to till the stubborn soil, she showed him how to space the seeds, a skill learned in a faraway home she never spoke of. Their hands often brushed, sending a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the cold ground. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and purple. A comfortable silence had grown between them, more eloquent than words. On an impulse, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Cole went absolutely still, every muscle tensed. He could smell the faint scent of soap and wood smoke in her hair. He slowly, hesitantly, raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She didn't pull away. He then gently traced the edge of the brand on her cheek. She flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "It is a part of me," she said, her voice low. "It's not who you are," he replied. His eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw not pity, but a raw, aching tenderness. He leaned closer, the ghosts of their pasts rising between them. For a heartbeat, the fear returned, fear of pain, of loss, of letting someone in. He saw it in her eyes, and she saw it in his. She pulled back slightly. The moment was broken. "It is late," she said, rising. "Good night, Cole." She disappeared inside, and he heard the soft click of her door closing. He sat on the porch until the stars were scattered across the sky, hating himself for his hesitation. The next morning, the distance had returned. A polite, careful chill settled over the cabin. Cole rode to Anna's grave, the first time he'd gone since the snows had melted. He stood before the simple wooden cross, the words caught in his throat. "I'm sorry, Anna," he finally said. "I thought honoring you meant being alone forever. But that's not living. It's just waiting to die." He realized he wasn't holding on to her memory to honor her, he was using it as a shield. "I think I'm falling in love with her," he confessed to the silent grave. "And it scares me to death." The weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a betrayal. It was permission. He rode back to the ranch with a new resolve. But the cabin was empty. A cold dread seized him. On the kitchen table lay a neatly folded pile of her mended clothes and a small leather pouch containing the $20 he'd paid for the town's doctor. A note lay beside it, written in careful, elegant script. "Thank you for your kindness. I cannot be a ghost in another person's home. I will not be the cause of your fear." She was gone. He had hesitated, and she had mistaken his fear for rejection. The silence that rushed back into the cabin was a crushing, physical force. He'd had his second chance at life, and he'd let it walk away. Cole found her in town, preparing to board the morning stagecoach heading east. She carried a small bundle, her entire world tied up in a piece of cloth. The townspeople watched, whispering. He saw Flint leaning against the hotel porch, a triumphant smirk on his face. Cole dismounted and walked toward her, his boots echoing on the dusty street. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. He stopped in front of her. "My." She wouldn't look at him. "There is nothing left to say." "The hell there isn't," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "I was a coward. I was afraid of feeling anything again because I didn't want to lose it. But losing you for a day has been worse than the last 3 years of being alone." Flint laughed aloud. "Listen to the gunslinger, begging for his property." Cole turned slowly. "She is not my property. She's my wife." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Mai's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. "You ain't married," Flint sneered, pushing himself off the porch rail. "There's no paper, no preacher." "There's my word," Cole said, his hand finally, naturally, coming to rest on the worn leather of his gun belt. "And here, that's law enough. If you or anyone else has a problem with that, state it now." Flint's eyes flickered to Cole's hand, to the deadly calm on his face. He saw the man he'd only heard stories about. He said nothing. Cole turned back to Mai. "I'm not asking you to be a servant," he said, his voice softening. "I'm asking you to build a life with me. To be my partner. To be scared with me. Please. Come home." He held out his hand. Tears streamed down her face, washing away the dust and the pain. She looked from his outstretched hand to his eyes, and she saw the truth. She saw a future. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. He squeezed it gently, his thumb resting near the brand on her cheek, not in pity, but in acceptance. Together, they turned and walked to his wagon, leaving the silent town and the morning stagecoach behind. They were married by the circuit preacher the following Sunday. That evening, on the porch of the cabin that was now truly their home, the golden light of sunset washed over them. The garden they had planted was thriving. "Next year," Cole said, his arm around her shoulders, "we'll add chickens." Mai leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Maybe a child," she said softly. Hope, once a terrifying stranger, had become a welcome guest. The marriage license hung on the wall, but the real covenant was written in the rich soil of their garden, in their shared silence, and in the courageous choice to face their fears together. "Do you ever regret it?" Mai asked, tracing the stitching on his shirt. "That day at the auction." Cole was quiet for a moment, watching the first stars appear. "Every day," he said. She stiffened slightly. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "I regret every day I wasted before it. I should have found you sooner." He kissed her then, a kiss that spoke of blizzards weathered and futures planted. The gunslinger had finally found a reason to lay his weapons down, and the woman in chains had finally found a place to be free. The spring had come late to their corner of Montana, but it had come to stay.